And that means we're looking at parallel structure again. This is, once again, a question from a difficult exam called the GMAT exam, and it's from the sentence correction part. There are actually lots of other parts in this exam, and some of them quite difficult, some of them quite easy. But this is the grammar part. Now, studying for this exam will help you understand well, it will help you improve. It will help you improve how to construct your sentences. I think it really helps you to understand the difference between a clear sentence and an ambiguous sentence. And this is a great example, number one. So let's read it. Like many of his contemporaries did, Bob Dylan wrote songs that became anthems for a generation of anti-war activists. Now, we have spoken about as and like before, because as and like are actually different if we're talking about academic English. If we're talking about everyday casual English, as and like are both subordinating conjunctions. We use them both as subordinating conjunctions. Now, what does that mean? You know, I mention a lot of these grammatical terms quite often, and it's because they do mean something very precise. So what does a subordinating conjunction do? Well, it always comes before a clause, yeah? So in everyday English, we say like many of his contemporaries did, and we say as many of his contemporaries did. But in academic English, they only allow you to say as many of his contemporaries did and not like many of his contemporaries did. And this is because it's as plus clause. As is a subordinating conjunction in academic English. Like isn't a subordinating conjunction. It's only a preposition, which means we see like plus noun. Okay, but that's the way to use as and like if we're talking about formal English. And this means even sentences which you might hear all the time. For example, you look like you've seen a ghost. Technically, they're wrong, and they should be you look as though, as if you have seen a ghost. Okay, so it does mean we already make mistakes with this in everyday English all the time, but it's not really a mistake in everyday English. You can use like plus clause when you're chatting, yeah, guys, but try to avoid it in any essay, in any academic essay. And this is why A on this question is wrong. It should be as many of his contemporaries did, not like. Okay, so we can get rid of A. Now B, let's look at B. Bob Dylan wrote songs like many of his contemporaries that became anthems for a generation of anti-war activists. Now, if you look at that, there are a number of confusing things in this sentence. And the main one for me is the part where it says he wrote songs like many of his contemporaries that became anthems. Yeah, his contemporaries that became anthems. Did his contemporaries become songs? It seems to be saying that the contemporaries became songs, and that's why B is ambiguous, and it's also why B is wrong. And I want you to notice that the that is a restrictive modifier. What the hell do I mean by that? The that is a relative pronoun. It starts a relative clause. What kind of relative clause? A defining relative clause, a restrictive relative clause. It defines contemporaries, the contemporaries that became anthems. Yeah, and we don't want to say that. We want to say the songs that became anthems and not the contemporaries that became anthems. And so this is wrong. B is wrong because it seems to suggest that the contemporaries became, the people became songs. Yeah, the contemporaries became anthems. And when you're using restrictive modifiers, what do I mean? I mean relative clauses, defining relative clauses. Make sure it's clear which noun they refer to. And they ought to be really to the noun closest to the relative pronoun, closest to the that. And here it's contemporaries, yeah? And so B is wrong because it makes it sound like the contemporaries are becoming songs. It's not acceptable. Let's have a look at C. As did many of his contemporaries, comma, Bob Dylan wrote songs. Well, that looks okay. Bob Dylan wrote songs that became anthems. Now, notice now we've got songs that became anthems, and that's what we want, yeah? So C is looking good. And by the way, Y on my questions, it always means that's the right answer. So C is looking good, and notice as well that here in C we are comparing contemporaries with Bob Dylan, yeah, as did many of his contemporaries. Bob Dylan wrote songs. In fact, we're comparing what the contemporaries did with what Bob Dylan did. And so that's a lovely comparison. It's logical. Let's look at D now. Like the songs of his contemporaries. Okay, this is okay for like. Yeah, the like is being used correctly here. Why? Because it's like plus noun phrase, and that's how we need to use it. We need to use it with like plus noun phrase and not like plus clause. So the songs of his contemporaries it's a noun phrase, so that looks good. Like the songs of his contemporaries, Bob Dylan wrote songs. So remember, what we've got here is like X, Y. Yeah, and it's very important to break things down to simplify sentences in this way. And so we're comparing X and Y. And so what are we comparing? Like the songs of his contemporaries. So we're comparing songs with Bob Dylan. Yeah, can you compare a man to a song? Like the songs of his contemporaries, Bob Dylan wrote songs. It's not okay. What we need to say is like the songs of his contemporaries, Bob Dylan's songs, and then we're comparing songs with songs, and that's what we want. It's a logical comparison, but D is not logical. It makes it sound like Bob is like the songs of his contemporaries, yeah? And Bob, of course, he's not similar to the songs of his contemporaries. His songs are similar to the songs of his contemporaries. So we've got to be precise. And now let's have a look at E, and I'll move it down a tiny bit because it's not quite on the screen. As did many of Bob Dylan's contemporaries, he. Now, the problem here is the he. Who does it refer to? Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Dave, it refers to Bob Dylan, obviously. But have we mentioned Bob yet? No, we haven't. When we say as did Bob's contemporaries, we don't mention Bob. We mention his contemporaries. And so if you say something like Dave's pen, blah, 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 you can't then say he to refer to Dave. Yeah, you can only say it to refer to the pen because you haven't mentioned Dave yet. So in E, it's wrong because the pronoun he is just dangling there with no reference. Yeah, what does it refer to? It's not clear at all what it refers to. Sorry, I've got a guest trying to get in. It's a little kitty. Oh, she's gone already. So yeah, make sure you're clear with your pronouns. If you use a he, it's got to refer to a man. And not to Bob Dylan's contemporaries. Contemporaries would be they, of course. It's plural. We can't use that he there to refer to Bob Dylan. Now, that's very important. Don't put a name in the possessive case. That's a determiner. It's not a noun. And think you can then refer to it afterwards as though it were a noun. It's not a noun, and so you can't then say he. So E is out. The he is really ambiguous. We don't know who it refers to. Okay, so C is the correct answer there. As did many of his contemporaries, Bob Dylan wrote songs that became anthems. That's all good. Okay, let's go on to number 2. And as you can see, when we're doing these questions, very often we're talking about comparisons. Very often we're talking about relative clauses. Very often we're talking about parallel structure. So all of these topics are very useful when you're doing these kind of tests. Okay, let's have a look at the next one, and it's quite a mouthful, this one. Unlike Mozart, whose funeral was sparsely attended, being buried in an unmarked common grave, Beethoven's was attended by more than 30,000 mourners, and his final resting place lies in a famous Vienna cemetery near the graves of Schubert and Brahms. Okay, now we got big, lots to get through here, and it looks like the last answer is the correct one. So let's talk about why all the others are wrong. And I'm going to simplify this. As always, simplification is key. What we've got here is unlike Mozart, yeah, so we've got unlike X, Y, and let's make sure that just like with the like Bob Dylan, his contemporaries, we've got to make sure the comparison is logical. So let's see what we're comparing in A. Oh, whoopsie daisy. Where is it? Let's have a look what we're comparing in A. So, unlike Mozart, whose funeral was sparsely attended, being buried in an unmarked common grave, Beethoven's. Now, notice you've got the apostrophe S. So, we're using the name in the possessive case again. So, we've got here, unlike Mozart, Beethoven's. So we've got to assume here that we mean Beethoven's funeral, because I don't know if you've noticed, but we're talking about a funeral. Is it okay to say, unlike Mozart, Beethoven's funeral? Now, I know it hasn't said the word funeral, but it must mean that, yeah, because you can't put Beethoven's into the possessive without it being Beethoven's something. Yeah, it's got to be Beethoven's funeral by the sounds of it with 30,000 mourners. Yeah, and is it okay to say, unlike Mozart, Beethoven's funeral? No, it's not. You're comparing Mozart to a funeral, and that's not allowed. You can compare Mozart to Beethoven, and you can compare Mozart's funeral to Beethoven's funeral, but you can't compare Mozart to Beethoven's funeral. It's totally illogical. So we can get rid of A straight away because we're saying, unlike Mozart, Beethoven's funeral, yeah, or Beethoven's was attended, we mean Beethoven's funeral. So A is definitely out. Let's go on to the, oh, whoopsie daisy. There it is. I think I'm on the right page. Let me just check. Yes, good. Okay, so let's look at B. Being buried in an unmarked common grave at Beethoven's funeral. So B is even clearer, is even worse than A. Well, they're both bad because we're comparing Mozart with Beethoven's something in A, I assume funeral, and in B we're comparing Mozart with Beethoven's funeral. So you can't do that, guys. If you're using like or unlike, if you're making a comparison, make sure the two things you're comparing are logical. Okay, let's look at C. So unlike Mozart, whose funeral was sparsely attended and he was buried in an unmarked common grave. Okay, now just listen to that, and I think you'll already hear there's something wrong with this. So unlike Mozart, whose funeral was sparsely attended and he was buried in an unmarked common grave. Compare that to the next two, D and E, yeah, whose funeral was sparsely attended and who was buried in an unmarked common grave, or whose funeral was sparsely attended and he was buried in an unmarked common grave. And you should be able to hear that because of this and, yeah, this and is joining two somethings. It's a conjunction. It joins things together. So what the hell is it joining? Well, in D and E, it's joining two relative clauses. Yeah, we've got whose funeral, blah, 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 blah. Whose is a relative pronoun. And so we've got whose, blah, 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 and who, blah, 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 blah. That's two relative clauses. That sounds a hell of a lot better than whose funeral was sparsely attended and he. In fact, you can't do what C has done. You can't change, once you've started with a relative pronoun, whose, and you're listing relative clauses, you can't suddenly use a he. You've got to keep using and who, and who, and who. Yeah, it doesn't make any sense at all to go back to and he. Yeah, it doesn't work. You can't do that, yeah, when you've started a list of relative clauses. So that's one reason why it's wrong. And I've also written here, okay, so we've got the right comparison. We've got, unlike Mozart, Beethoven was given a funeral. That's good. Unlike Mozart, Beethoven. So we got the right comparison here. But look at this last and I'm quite anal about commas, or I enjoy looking at why we use commas. And I would argue that that and requires a comma, especially because it's before, well, it's a fanboy conjunction and it's joining two main clauses, two independent clauses. His final resting place lies near the graves of Schubert and Brahms is a main clause, and you've got a main clause before it. So if you're going to do that, definitely put a comma before the and. So it's another reason why it's not good. Okay, if you look at D, we've got, unlike Mozart, Beethoven's funeral again and again. That is not okay. That's not acceptable. That's not a good comparison. Now let's have a look at E, which is, of course, the correct answer. And we've got and who was buried, which sounds a bit better than being buried, and who was buried in an unmarked common grave. Beethoven was given. Notice we've got a parallel structure with was buried, was given. That's nice. Past simple in the passive, and it's repeated, was buried, was given. So that's nice. A funeral attended by more than 30,000 mourners and lies buried. Here we don't have an independent clause after the and. The subject is missing, and he lies buried. We had the his final resting place as a subject, lies near. But here we've not got no subject, so you don't need a comma. And lies buried near the graves of Schubert and Brahms in a famous Vienna cemetery. Okay, so that should be clear now why E is the correct answer there. So that's all I wanted to do this morning. I've got a couple more classes starting pretty soon, but perhaps I'll definitely do another class tomorrow, possibly still on these kind of topics, tricky topics of how to choose the correct answer in a very difficult exam, but possibly something else, maybe some more vocabulary for tomorrow. We'll see. Okay, so thanks everybody for watching. Please go to skypelessons.com if you want to look at some of the exercises that I've written and look at some of the new classes that I've made this year. Thanks everybody for coming. I hope to see you all soon.